Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. In this episode, I'm sharing with you a conversation with Dr. Korie Leigh, who is an author, professor, child life specialist, and grief counselor who works with children and teenagers. And we're talking about her book, It Won't Ever Be the Same, A Teen's Guide to Grief and Grieving. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation, so stay tuned for that. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe using the link down below. And also subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. And go to eoluniversity.com/support if you're willing and able to make a small contribution to help keep this show and the podcast on the air. So we'll move on with that conversation right now. And I'll see you the next time. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my special guest, Dr. Korie Leigh. Korie is a published author, university professor, child life specialist, and grief counselor. She has spent 20 years working with children and families experiencing grief and loss. As an associate professor and program director of the Thanatology program at Marian University, she teaches graduate courses on child development, death, dying, and bereavement. She is also the author of 2 books, What Does Grief Feel Like? And It Won't Ever Be the Same, A Teen's Guide to Grief and Grieving. And you can learn more at her website, KorieLeighPhD.com, and that's spelled KorieLeigh. phd.com, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. So, Korie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on and extending the invitation to have this conversation today.
Yeah, I've been really excited to learn more about your work, and especially after reading your book, which we'll get into a little later in the interview. But I'd love to hear your story first. And how did you first start working with families, children, and teens around grief?
Yeah, so I was one of those kids, and I think we all know them that they're very clear about what they want to do or who they want to be when they grow up. I didn't have the language at the time, but I knew that I wanted to work with hospitalized children. That's as much as I knew. And of course, there's a lot of ways that you can do that. And my path led me to the field of child life. And for listeners that are not entirely clear on what child life is, or if they've never been exposed to that, child life specialists are trained to work in a hospital setting with hospitalized children, helping to prepare them for medical procedures, supporting them through painful experiences, and helping them understand what's happening to their bodies, and doing so in a way that is building resilience and coping skills for the whole family. And so that's really where I started. It really just morphed from working in hospitals with children to working in hospices with adults who were dying. And I would just get all of the child referrals. So when grandma or grandpa was in hospice and there were children in the home, those cases would go to me. And then very quickly after that, I transitioned into pediatric hospice and palliative care. Um, so I think at this point, I've spent about 20 years working in the field. And I was one of those people that at the age of 18, I knew what I was going to do. So I've been working in the field since then. Of course, like building my skill set and my educational experiences to help scaffold and provide me with a more solid foundation. And so after I obtained my bachelor's in child development and child life, I went back to school and obtained my master's in public health with a concentration in thanatology. And for your listeners that are unfamiliar with that term, thanatology is the study of death, dying, grief, and loss. And it's an inherently multidisciplinary study. And so you can really look at thanatology from multiple perspectives. You can look at it from a sociological perspective, psychology, anthropology, applied healthcare. There is a student in my academic program that is a linguist, and he studies dead and dying languages. So I was quite interested in that intersection of child development, the impact that stress, hospitalization, and illness has on child development, and that led me to the field of thanatology.
Hmm. Wow, it's a fascinating story just of how our paths, how our paths meander a little bit to end up and bring us where we
Yeah.
are. But it seems to me like you're at the right, exactly the right juncture of everything that you've studied and been interested in your work with teens and children around grief. And you mentioned doing work in hospice with teens and children and families who have had a loved one die. And when I look back on my hospice days, I feel concerned even now that I'm not sure we did a very good job of reaching out to children's and teens, because I think about the materials we had around bereavement support that were all geared toward adults. And it seems that for many years, and probably still, children and teens get overlooked a bit when we talk about grief. And is that your experience as well?
Yes, absolutely. And in the literature, we call them the forgotten mourners. It's written about quite frequently how, especially younger children, under the age of 5, are oftentimes very overlooked. There's a concept called disenfranchised grief, which was coined by Ken Doka. And essentially, what that is talking about is the idea that society itself is failing the griever in some way, that there is no space for your grief. And there's 5 different categories that one can fall under within disenfranchised grief. And one of them is that the griever themselves is excluded. And so if you look at the entire population of children and teens, they're an inherently disenfranchised population.
And also a population that cannot advocate for themselves very well because developmentally they don't even know that they need help or that they could or should advocate for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a big role and continues to be a big role in what I do, in the work that I do in pediatric hospice and palliative care, is helping to advocate for children, for families, but also empowering children and families to learn how to advocate for themselves.
And it seems like children do get overlooked. Adults in the family are grieving themselves so deeply, and they may look at children and also teens and think, well, they're doing fine. And I remember
Yes.
that I mean, I used to hear it all the time. They're too young. They won't even remember that a death happened, and how totally wrong that notion was. But I think it still persists in some way. If it looks like they're okay, then they must be fine. So we don't need to talk to them about it.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the really big things that I do in my clinical work and my academic work and my research and consultation is helping adults understand how grief looks different in children and how and why it is first and foremost developmentally informed, right? So one of the prime examples that I talk with parents and caregivers about is how for us, we oftentimes grieve very emotively. And so through our emotions, we will be sad, we will cry, we will be angry, we will express those things emotionally. For children, they are still feeling the same things that we are feeling, but they are expressing it behaviorally. And so for younger children, you're absolutely right. You may see them never cry. And so if you don't see a child cry and you see them playing and going to school and getting relatively good grades, the assumption is that they're not grieving and that they're totally fine. Whereas if we start to look beneath that and we look at behaviors or we notice some regressions are happening, a child that was previously potty trained is now all of a sudden going back to diapers, or a child that moved to a big kid bed is now asking to sleep with mom and dad. Um, a child that has developed new fears. And so the grief is going to come out in all these different behavioral ways first. Children can and absolutely do grieve emotively, but their capacity for that is just very, very different than that of adults.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And then hence adults just don't know, they don't know to ask questions, or maybe they don't even have the bandwidth or the capacity if they themselves are grieving.
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the reasons that I wrote my first book, What Does Grief Feel Like? For younger children. There are questions embedded throughout the pages that help the parent and caregiver not have to struggle to find the words. The questions are right there for you. They're embedded in the pages. That's one of the most common questions I get from parents is, what do I say? How do I say it? How often do I ask these questions? And so really both of my books, stem out of a really big gap, both in the literature and in the resources. And that is one of the intentions that I have is to help and, put those resources back into the hands of the families that are going to need it the most.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview to tell people about these resources, which well, we'll get into it a little bit more, but they're books that everyone doing this work, if you're in hospice, if you're a death doula, if you're a grief counselor, you should have these books on your shelf as a resource to loan to families or recommend that they purchase these gifts, in my opinion. But I did want to ask you because I read some statistics on your website about how common grief is in children and teens, which I found even surprising to me because I just wasn't aware.
Yeah, so there is a really wonderful organization called Judy's House. They're based out of Denver, and they have a research team, and their research team compiles statistics every year and comes out with something called the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model. So you can go to their website, click on the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model Toolkit, click on your individual state, and look at the rates, the statistics of grieving children. Nationally, it's about 1 out of every 10 children will experience the death of a parent or a sibling, just a parent or sibling. We're not talking about anyone else by the time that they're 18. Here, where I live in the state of New Mexico, we are sadly number 2 on that list. I believe West Virginia is number 1. And so in the state of New Mexico, it's about 1 out of every 7 or 8 children
Mm.
will experience the death of a parent or a sibling before the age of 18. Now, we start to kind of expand outside of that. You think of not just parents and siblings, but grandparents, community members, classmates, teachers, um, family members, aunts, uncles, nephews. And we start to notice that that number keeps expanding exponentially. So in any given classroom, if you have a classroom of 26 students, there are going to be at least 2 of those children that are actively grieving a fresh new loss. Plus, because we recognize that grief is inherently developmental, we know that there are way more than 2 children out of 26 that are grieving a loss. Maybe there was a loss that happened last year or a few years before. So when we start to look at that and just see how pervasive and common it is, we intersect with grieving children all of the time.
And so that really makes me think we need to be training teachers at all levels to recognize grief and to have understand how to help students in their classes that are grieving since our children spend so many hours each day in the classroom.
Yes, absolutely. And that is one thing that I also do in my practice is I will, go to school districts. I will do professional development trainings for teachers, and things like that. There's also the New York Life Foundation has I forget exactly where it is on the website, but if you go to the New York Life Foundation, click on grief and bereavement, there's a specific toolkit for teachers on how to become a grief informed classroom and how to become a grief informed school.
Wow, that's fantastic to learn about. I'm going to put that in the show notes also because it sounds like something that could be very helpful. And even, I think of parents who have a child who might be grieving in school, even something to recommend to the teacher or take to the school to say, it's not just my child, other children are grieving and you need to learn about this.
Absolutely. And then when you recognize also that a child is never a child in isolation, right? They're a part of a system, they're a part of a family, and that family is a part of a community, and that school is a part of that community. And so oftentimes when a loss occurs in a community, everyone is feeling that impact. So a lot of what I do when I go into school districts and help teachers understand the grief of the students, we also directly talk about the grief of the teachers
Mm,
and how that's so much for the teacher to be holding at any given time is trying their very best to attend to and attune to the needs of the classroom when they themselves may also be grieving. So part of becoming a grief-informed environment is recognizing that grief and loss is a natural part of life. It is very common, and all of us carry some kind of grief. And there are so few opportunities to openly acknowledge that and to also learn how to navigate it, right? It's one thing to even be able to say that a loved one has died, and it's a whole other kind of aspect to be able to know, well, what do we do with this grief? What do we do with this feeling? What even is grief? How do we explain that to ourselves, let alone how do we explain that to children? And that's what my books and my work is all about, is helping to be a translator for those adults in a child's life.
yeah. Do you have just a couple of tips you could share for teachers about addressing grief in the classroom, given they probably already have so much they have to cover in a day? Like any suggestions for if there's a grieving child in the classroom, something they might do?
Yeah, so I certainly recommend a lot of communication between the teacher and the primary caregivers. You know, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of layers to these conversations, you know, including the child's cultural beliefs and religious customs and the comfort of the family in addressing these things. That being said, I think part of having these conversations is adopting that grief-informed stance. I remember back when I was in first grade, and this is long before any of these kind of books existed, long before even that term grief informed existed. My first grade class, we had a protocol, we had a ritual, if I can call it that, that any student in the class that experienced a death, and it could be the death of anyone or anything, it can be the hamster, the dog, the cat, grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, student experienced a death, and we would have an opportunity in class where every student would make some kind of art. It would be a card or a picture, and then we would have a receiving line where the student that was grieving would start at the top of the class and walk to each person in the class and receive a token, receive condolences, be able to talk about it openly. And it was one of those policies where, you know, if every child in the class had a death that year, we were going to have 26, you know, grief rituals. So things like that, where it can become embedded into the classroom, is a really good way to start. The other thing, and I used to teach in a school of education. I taught early childhood educators. I taught their play class, and I also taught a death and dying class. And the first day of both the play class and the death and dying class, I sat my students down and I said, the best thing that you can do to help facilitate these conversations about death and dying is get a goldfish, get a sickly goldfish, and hope that it dies during the school year. What a teachable moment that you can have for your class, that you can help to start to scaffold and build these conversations in a safe place where children are familiar, they trust you, they can ask open-ended questions, and you can start to talk about death and dying in that way. And then everyone got the goldfish died anywhere from a week to 2 months into the school year. And it was a part of the process of talking about death. When you know, go on a nature walk and you see a dead bug, talk about that dead bug. So that's another thing that just in general, especially for the early childhood educators and the people that are teaching the younger kids. And then the other thing that is a really quite easy intervention and tool to use is bibliotherapy. And so having books in the class that directly address grief, death, loss is one of the best things that you can do. And so having those books with those themes readily available, and again, integrating that into the culture of the classroom, those are all really good things that anybody can start with.
Oh, I love those ideas. And I was thinking about the benefits of that ritual that you described that you experienced in your classroom and how helpful it is to all the students in the classroom to be supporting someone else who's grieving and learning about what do we do when someone we know has experienced a loss, because today most of us don't know that or have a clue about what to do and how to support someone else, but to start learning that in childhood and experiencing that it's normal and it's a good thing to reach out and do something kind for someone who's grieving. Just that simple message
Mhm.
seems so very powerful. I wish we had that happening in every school. Maybe it's getting better. I don't really have a sense of that. If there's more grief informed education going on.
Yeah, I think that if you look at it on like a macro level, I do think that there are some systemic changes that are happening in school districts across the country. Sadly, we are faced with more catastrophic death events now than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. Everything from school shootings to natural disasters like what's happening in North Carolina, in Florida with these natural disasters that are happening and the devastation. And so then we start talking about the grief that's experienced not just from the death of a person, but from the loss of a home, the loss of safety, security. So these are much more ambiguous losses that aren't necessarily tied to the death of a person, though they may be in some of these events. But the experience of grief and grieving is felt in a very similar way. But again, we don't necessarily have the language, the spaces, the resources to directly address that, you know, the home was lost in a tornado, the home was destroyed in a tornado. Everyone is safe and okay. How good for that family. And also there's grief over the destruction of the home, maybe having to move to a new place, maybe going to a new school, maybe having to leave all of your friends. So being able to address the way that grief is felt at the loss of something that we hold an attachment to is one of the first places that I start with kids and families I work with.
Yeah, and the variety of emotions associated with loss, and also the fact that you can be experiencing loss in the midst of a happy time when something good is happening at the same time. You can still be experiencing loss and those emotions all together, all at once.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when I talk with younger kids about feelings and emotions and what they feel like in the body, or if they're associated with a color, we start with the core emotions, with like the primary emotions. And then we move up to what we call mixed emotions, where you can feel happy and sad at the same time, where you can feel angry and scared at the same time, happy and angry at the same time. Right. So we start to build out the emotional vocabulary for the kids so that they can be able to name and identify what it is that they're feeling.
And that's something I really appreciated in your book. It won't ever be the same. A teen's guide to grief and grieving is helping them identify and recognize what's happening within them physically, emotionally, mentally in their own brain, um, because of grief. And I think you're right. It's hard to find the words to talk about it, which is why having a book to read is really helpful, because you do such a great job of depicting it and using the stories and the writing of other teens and children who are experiencing grief. It's so powerful.
Oh, thank you so much. And that was absolutely an intention that I had, was to highlight teen voices, find ways to take this really complicated and layered topic and make it palatable, make it not as scary to touch and to engage with. And I was also quite intentional about not making my book too wordy, because that's the other thing is there are so many amazing grief books out there. But when you are actively grieving, especially in what we call early grief in the first like 6 to 12 months, the parts of your brain that help you concentrate and retain information and focus, those parts are not working as adequately as they would under other circumstances. And so you might only be able to read like a paragraph or a few sentences before you lose focus. And that's another reason why the book is divided up into those different sections. And sometimes on one page, there's only a question to ponder, or there's an activity to do instead of a lot of text to read.
Yes, I really appreciated that about the book and the fact that there are activities in each session. Well, you also you include reflections, so something for them to reflect on, think about, maybe journal about the activities. Give it a try. I liked that title for activities, intentions, and feelings. And it's it's such a perfect combination in this book to help children understand their grief, experience the feelings, but embody it and act on it and do something physical in a way that helps them even see the grief before them by something that they've created. And I think it's really wonderful.
Oh, absolutely. And I use those same basic principles, but just much more simply in my first book, What Does Grief Feel Like? So one of the questions that's embedded in the pages of that book is, if your grief were a color, what color would it be? Right. So we start with just naming and identifying, putting shape and texture, size and color to what this grief is. And then in the teen book, I expand upon that. Like, okay, not only is, what color is your grief, but where do you feel it in your body? And if you were to create a collage of this, what images would you use? How big of a piece of paper would you use? So we really take that idea that grief is a biopsychosocial experience. We used to think that grief was just an emotional experience. It's the emotions that we feel after someone dies. And we now know that it is the entire person that is grieving. Our brain has changes. Our gut biome has changes. We have different immune markers and inflammatory markers happening in our blood. The way that we relate to people socially changes. The way that we feel emotions and the intensity of that changes. Our relationship to spirituality and faith, or our religion, that changes. The family system itself changes. And so when we can start to recognize that grief for all of not just what we feel, but how we think and what we do, what we believe and how we interact, we can start to touch it a little bit, right? We can start to be able to engage with it. And especially using different art interventions and nonverbal ways of addressing and engaging in this experience of grief can be very validating, very powerful. And some of the clients that I work with, it's only after they've been able to engage in some of these activities that they can start to talk about their grief and find the words for it.
Yes, I loved all the activities. I went back through and reread some of them because they're really profound. I mean, fairly simple things. Sometimes they require some materials, but one that I really liked that I would love to use myself with other people is the idea of a support bracelet, like a friendship bracelet. If you wouldn't want to talk about that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another example of an activity that I've done with children as young as 3 and people as old as I think 83 is maybe the oldest client that I've worked with, experiencing spousal loss. And exactly. So you can make this as simple or as blingy and glittery as you want to. But simply talking about the different people in one's life or the different places in one's life that you can get support from when you're feeling like you need to talk with someone. And then you assign that person or place a color. So let's say that one of the places that you get support from is your church, and you wanted to name that church the color purple. And so church is represented by purple, and then mom is represented by blue, and your best friend Chloe is represented by blue. And so then you take those three colors and you can braid them together. You can put charms on the bracelet. And then you wear that bracelet as also an indication that you have those support systems with you at all times. This can also be another way in which teachers can become involved in supporting the grieving student. So let's say that the student has created this kind of a bracelet. And maybe there are times throughout the day that are harder for that student to get through. Maybe there's a subject that's really hard or a time of day. And instead of standing up and telling, using the words, the teacher that they're needing support or they need to take a step out, maybe they show their bracelet in a certain way. I've had kids also wear necklaces, and whenever they show it or they flip the necklace so that it shows a certain thing, that's an indication to the teacher, like, oh, okay, that's our cue. And then the teacher just gives them the cue to go to the guidance counselor's office, go get a drink of water. So it's almost like this unspoken way of
Mm.
the child and the being able to advocate for their needs, but do so in a way that doesn't feel like they're having to disclose information in front of people that they're uncomfortable doing. And that also helps the teacher be able to understand and recognize the needs of their grieving student.
It's so empowering for the child to be able to act on their own behalf and get what they need without feeling so vulnerable and so exposed to other
Mhm.
children. That's really brilliant.
Yeah.
So that I'm just really thrilled with with all of the ideas in your book. Also, how it encourages continuing bonds with loved ones after they've died. I think that's really beautiful as well. And you have some other activities there to help with continuing bonds, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the bigger aspects of the grieving process, not just for teenagers, but for people in general, that we oftentimes aren't able to engage with as actively. Because for a long time, right, we used to believe, and the literature would support the idea that, the grieving process was to detach from the person who died, to move on with your life and let them go and create this new normal for yourself. But we now know that it is not only adaptive, it is healthy, it helps build resilience, and it's meaningful for a lot of bereaved people to continue that relationship. But the difference here is, right, is that the death ends the life. It doesn't end the relationship, but the relationship itself is fundamentally different.
Mhm.
And so a lot of these activities in the book are being used as a facilitator to help teens start to think about, well, what does it mean that I'm still a big brother? What does that mean to me? And how can I still have a relationship with my sibling that's died? And for a lot of teens, at least a lot of the teens that I have worked with, one of the ways that they do that, that they honor their sibling's memory, is by doing something, engaging in an act, whether that's taking up a sport that their sibling liked, trying a new instrument, wearing different kind of clothes, or, cutting your hair a certain way that helps you remind yourself of that person. So these are all things that we do them inherently, but sometimes we need to see those things to know, like, oh, like it's okay that I do that, to get that validation. And that's another thing that I really love about the book, is that there are so many stories from other teenagers. Here's how I did it, or here's what it was like when my dad died, or here's how I first felt like my grief was 5 years ago, and here's how it is now.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. So I do want to encourage people, you really need to check this book out. I haven't seen anything like it anywhere, and I get lots of books from lots of people all the time around grief, and I haven't seen anything similar to your book that's addressed to teens and also to children, the first book. And so I think they're books that everyone should have in their library. But I wanted to talk as well about some of the work that you do, because um, it sounds like you do some individual therapy and coaching, and wanted you to just tell us what you offer online and what else is available.
Yeah, absolutely. So I live here in New Mexico. However, in the age of technology that we live in, most of the clients that I see one-to-one are scattered throughout the country. In the clinical work that I do specialize in child loss, and that is inclusive of pregnancy loss, things like stillbirth, termination for medical reasons, miscarriage, infant loss, all the way up through child loss. And so you can work with me virtually on Zoom from anywhere in the country. And then here in New Mexico, I also do clinical work with a nonprofit that's called Heroes Path Palliative. And we are the state's only pediatric palliative care nonprofit. And at this moment in time, we mostly provide advocacy, education, and psychosocial support, though the long-term goal is to build a freestanding respite and hospice house for children and families that will serve, the entire state of New Mexico. And so with a nonprofit, I do a lot of home-based work. I drive all over northern New Mexico to see families in their home and provide psychosocial support to the patient, to the sibling, to the entire family. And we focus a lot on that intersection of play, creativity, building new coping skills, and helping the family to navigate these really challenging times. A lot of the families I work with have children that are what we call medically complex. So they have multiple diagnoses. These are a lot of kids that are, dependent on trachs and G tubes and our total care. And these families very often get no breaks. And like a lot of states across the country, we are very resource poor here in New Mexico. And so a lot of these families, they qualify for at-home nursing, but there are no nurses to go and show up to the home. So mom is now a 24/7 caregiver on top of a job that she might be doing. Or for a lot of our families, the parents or one of the parents can no longer work and has to, do total care for the child. And so what Heroes Path does is we provide that wraparound service. We provide the resources and the advocacy and the support for the whole family.
Oh, that's really wonderful. Wonderful to hear that. I went to medical school at the University of New Mexico, so that touches my heart because I have a special
Oh,
love for New Mexico, and I can just imagine you driving around to this all the small communities. It's really wonderful work. I'm grateful that you're able to do
yeah.
that.
Thank you. Yeah. And for any of your listeners that are in New Mexico, we are always looking for volunteers and we're looking for people to be on our fundraising committees and to, try and raise the funds necessary to build our respite and hospice house.
Oh, well, that's good to know about as well, because I love supporting causes like that and getting the word out because it's just so important. And I like the way you're meeting the needs of the community by finding the gaps that are there. And I think that's how we build compassionate communities is by just seeing what's missing here. Maybe we're doing really well in this area, but this is missing, and we need to step up and try to fill
Hmm.
in the gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the approach that I take with my writing as well, is, identifying those gaps. My first book really stemmed out of quite a deep frustration I had at the time of the lack of developmentally appropriate literature for younger children. There were some books that were really well written on death, but none that were specific to the grieving experience, and none that were written, with that intersection of child development, developmentally appropriate language. It's also grief informed, and that also has beautiful illustrations that are helping to really evoke an emotional response as you're reading the page. And so that my first book rolled around in my head for a good 10 years before it just poured out of me one day.
Mm. Yeah. And I haven't read the first one yet, so now I have to get that so that I can read that as well. I'm a grandmother now, and so my oldest grandchild is 2, but yeah, I'm really well aware of these things and that, well, my son was 2 when my father died, and so I didn't quite I didn't quite know if he would feel grief or even understand what death was at the age of 2. I realized it would have been really nice to have a book to read with him, but we told him Grandpa had died and that he's in heaven now because we didn't know what else to say. That's all we just needed to have a place to say where grandfather was. And so anyway, I think that I could have done a better job in terms of supporting him through grief, but I wasn't even sure if he experienced it at 2. But clearly he did because of things he told us later.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a quote from Alan Wolfelt that I use all the time because it's just so true. It's if a child is old enough to love, they are old enough to grieve.
Mm,
And if we take that premise and we apply it, and we're also looking from a developmental lens, infants grieve. If one of their primary attachment figures is either gone, physically gone, or that primary attachment figure is having an intense emotional response, that baby is going to pick up the emotional cues. Babies are so good at reading facial cues, right? We know in child development, the Edtronic still face experiments. If listeners are not familiar with that, it's a fascinating study. You can literally just Google or look on YouTube, Edtronic still face experiment, and see how even at 6 months old, babies are highly attuned to facial features,
mm,
to smiling faces, to frowny faces, to completely still faces. And so, if we recognize that that's happening in normal child development, and then we layer on top that the primary caregiver is grieving, 1 year olds grieve, 2 year olds grieve. Cognitively, does a 2 year old understand the finality and irreversibility of death? No, but that doesn't prevent them from still feeling really intense emotions and
mhm.
and even having questions about, well, where are they and when are they coming back? And what is this magical place called heaven that everyone seems to go to? I want to go there too, right? I have worked with a lot of parents that have younger children around the age of 3 that have that belief system in heaven. And they've called me up in a panic many times, being like, oh, I think my child is having suicidal ideations. They said that they want to die and go to heaven too. And so having to really help the parents understand developmentally what's happening in their child's brain and why cognitively heaven is this magical faraway place. It's no different than Disney if the child hasn't been there, right? It's a place
Sure.
that
Yeah.
people want to go to. Ideally, we all get to go there someday, but you never go back. So it must be so amazing that you want to
Yeah.
live there forever.
And people we love are there. So
And
that's even better.
yeah, yeah.
That's so interesting because mentioning that with my son, a few months later after my dad died, when we went back to my parents' home, my son saw my dad's pickup in front of the house and started crying. And I said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because Grandpa forgot to take his pickup to heaven." And he said, "How will he go fishing now? Because he doesn't have his."
Hmm.
And it was like, wow, that blew me away. Like he has been carrying this and aware and thinking about it and thinking about grandpa and who he is and what grandpa does,
Yeah.
grandpa loves. All of that was coming together in his little 2-year-old brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a prime example of when children are at that age, 2, 3, 4-ish, they're what we call pre-operational, right? So they live in this world of magical thinking where things are taken very concretely, very literally. So in my work with families, one of the biggest things that I, encourage families to do is to avoid euphemisms, things like, they've passed or they've gone away or simply they've gone to heaven, or another one I've heard a lot is the angels came to take them. We need to use the words dead, die. We need to help children understand that when someone dies, it's forever, that their body stops working forever. And then, depending on the religious or the cultural system that that child and family is in, we can start to add layers to that. And then when someone dies in our family, their body stays here on earth because it is dead and it doesn't work anymore. And the part of them that makes them special, we call that a soul. We call that a spirit. No one can see that part. You can't touch it, but that's the part that makes everyone special. And that invisible part, that's what goes to heaven, or that's what gets reincarnated, or that's what becomes the stars in the sky, whatever the belief system is. And so really
Yeah.
trying to take something that is quite abstract, distill it into the most concrete, literal language that we can think of as a starting place for kids.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such good advice. And I'm sure that your book is helpful in that regard too, with questions that you can ask children and to initiate these discussions and conversations.
Yeah, and especially in the first book, there is a parent and a caregiver guide in the back of the book, and it has like everything that we've just talked about. There's a three-page guide for how to have the conversation, what to say, the most common questions that children ask, and then there's a page where it breaks down from infants until school age, developmentally, what can you expect with an infant that's grieving, a toddler that's grieving, a preschooler.
Oh, that's so helpful. That's what I could have used. I could have used that so many years ago. And
And you did the best that you could with what you had at the time. And that's all we can do. That's all any of us can do. I have a very niched field of expertise, right? Most people don't have the information that I have or haven't studied what I have. And so you all need to do what you need to do at the time you need to do it.
yeah,
And the beauty of resilience and the beauty of growing through change and growing through hardship is you can always go back and have these conversations. It's never too late. It is never too late to start.
yeah, so very true. And I am aware of the challenge of being, a parent with very young children, grieving myself and trying to find the space and the energy and even the brain power to have
Yeah.
to have a conversation or to know how to proceed with them. And it's very challenging. Parents need a lot of support and a lot of help during those times. So I'm grateful that you're there just to guide parents through when they're trying to
Yeah.
support their own children.
Well, and that's what my third book is about. I'm currently in the revision process for, we don't have a title for it yet, but it will essentially be a parenting guide to grief. So parenting through grief. And as a parent, how do you hold both of those realities? You yourself are grieving, and you are also wanting to do the very best that you can to support your child through their grief. And so I believe that book will be out sometime in 2026.
Oh gosh, I'm glad to hear about that because that meets the gap that we were talking about of people not recognizing the needs of children to grieve or sometimes overlooking it because um, because it looks like the child's doing well, and also the parents and adults don't have the resources or know how to proceed.
Mhm.
So that'll be really wonderful. You'll have to come back again and we'll talk about that book.
Yeah, I
Um,
would love to. I would love to.
well, one other thing I forgot to ask you earlier on your website, I saw that you mentioned the CPT method for working with children's teens and families. I wanted to ask you what that is because I haven't heard of that before.
I'm an acronym person. That's just like how I am. So it isn't like a trademarked thing, but it's my methodology, my training, and the interventions that I use of working with children and families. And so C stands for collaborative and creative. And so, first and foremost, I am going to be using creativity and collaboration with everybody that I work with. The P is very much play based. And so, especially with young children, I will be using play and different modalities. I am not a play therapist, but I use play therapeutically, and I also use it as an assessment tool. And so, the difference between those two things, right, is I'm not diagnosing, I'm not treating grief as a mental health condition. I am using play, which is the language of young children, to help them process and understand and express what is happening to them. And then, because of my training, I'm able to take what a child and how they are playing and interpret that for the parents, help them understand what themes are you going to notice in your child's play? What does the repetitive play look like? And what does that mean? And what could some of the symbols in your child's play be meaning in their day-to-day life? And then T is trauma informed. And so, with everybody that I'm working with, I am coming from a trauma informed background and really understanding the way that trauma impacts the brain and impacts the relational dynamics that are happening. And so, in a nutshell, that is CPT.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, if someone wanted to work with you, how do they go about doing that and making that happen?
Yeah, they can go to my website, PhD.com, and there is a contact me. I think it might be called Work With Me, is what the tab is called. And you can just click on that, and there's a short little thing that you can fill out, just name and email address, and a short little note. And then that kicks to my email address, and we can start the conversation.
And so you do one-on-one therapy with people. And then do you have some online courses that you're teaching as well?
Yeah, I do. So the academic program that I am a professor in, and I'm also the program chair in, is a Master of Science in Thanatology. We also offer a certificate in Thanatology. And this year we have launched our undergraduate certificate in Thanatology and also a minor. And that is offered through Marian University. And it is the Marian that is in Wisconsin, not the one in Indianapolis.
Oh, okay.
I get that question all of the time. But yeah, we are a fully online asynchronous program. We have 7 week semesters. So our curriculum is designed for the working adult professional.
Mm.
So our semesters are 7 weeks long. We have rolling admission. So you can start anytime you want, really. The longest that you'll have to wait is 7 weeks if a semester's already started. And we have students from all over the world. We have people that are already working in a thanatology profession. We have hospice professionals, healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, child life specialists, music therapists. We have a lot of people in the funeral industry, so funeral directors, folks in mortuary sciences. We have a lot of therapists, psychologists, art therapists, movement therapists, and then a subset of folks that are interested in being a death doula. And so we offer a track specifically in that. And then we have another interesting group of individuals that are coming from a completely different background. So maybe these are people in finance or marketing or worked for a Fortune 500 company and they want to make a shift, or they want to figure out how to take the information from thanatology and apply it to their current work environment to help create a more healthy, grief-informed work environment.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I had no idea that program existed, the Thanatology program. So I'm glad to know about it and let listeners know about it as well. And especially being all online, then I'm sure it's bound to appeal to people who are listening and who want to really broaden their education and the tools they have to offer people.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another thing about our program that is different. There are a few other programs out there, but ours is an applied program. So we are really looking at not just the theory and the foundation, but taking that and applying it to the work that you are either already doing or you want to be doing.
It's really exciting to me, especially to hear that there are people from other disciplines who are interested in applying thanatology to the work they do, because that's what we need if we want to move forward as a society that is more death informed, grief informed. Um, that's exactly what needs to happen. So I'm excited to even know that that exists and that you're offering that. So so hopefully,
Yeah.
I'm hoping these ideas will spread and other training programs will be inspired in some ways, maybe to expand what they're offering also.
Absolutely. Yes. And, it's what's very interesting about the field is, as I've said in our conversation when we first started, is it's a multidisciplinary field. And so in the United States and Canada, we're quite an applied practical field versus in other countries like in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the UK, it's much more of a philosophically based study. And so people are taking these concepts and applying it to their current work in anthropology or sociology, looking at the sociology of dying. I have a colleague in the Netherlands who her entire research platform is looking at the way that cemeteries are utilized in the Netherlands.
Mm.
So it's so fascinating the way that not just geographically but culturally we are looking at this topic that is just so applicable to every field. And I'm a really big believer that we should be having more thanatology programs. I think more of them should exist. And the one that we have at Marian is it's the right fit if you're interested in that applied practice and you're interested in an asynchronous online 7-week program.
That sounds amazing. I'm so glad to have learned about that, along with your books, which are incredible resources, and just all the work that you're doing. It's been really inspiring to talk to you.
No, thank you. It's been such an honor to be on your show, and thank you for doing the work that you're doing and helping to spread awareness of grief-informed communities and death-informed communities. I think that we can all be doing a little bit of work. You know, we can shine our light in one area, and then when we look to the side and we see all the other lights that are shining, we realize like what a big impact we're all collectively having.
Yeah, so true. Well, it's like we're creating our support bracelet we can look at and remember, oh gosh, I'm not the only person out there trying to make a
Yeah.
difference in this area. There's so many people out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that way of thinking of it.
Yeah. Well, I'll remind everyone that your website is korieleephd.com. And again, I'll put links to that and to the Thanatology program and your books um, on the show notes for this episode so everyone can be in touch with you. And I'm so excited to share this information with other people.
And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Korie Leigh and learning about grief in children and teens, and that you'll get a copy of her book, It Won't Ever Be the Same, which it's a fantastic resource to have on hand for teenagers in your life. And until we're together next time with the next interview, take care. Bye bye.